Were you at Lady Danbury's ball last night? If not, shame on you. You missed witnessing quite the most remarkable coup of the season. It was clear to all party-goers, and especially to this author, that Miss Daphne Bridgerton has captured the interest of the newly returned to England Duke of Hastings. One can only imagine the relief of Lady Bridgerton. How mortifying it will be if Daphne remains on the shelf for yet another season, and Lady B, with three more daughters to marry off. Oh, the horror. Lady Whistledown's Society Papers, April 30th, 1813. There was no way Daphne could refuse. First of all, her mother was impaling her with her deadly "I am your mother, don't you dare defy me" gaze. Secondly, the Duke had clearly not given Anthony the entire story of their meeting in the dimly lit hallway. To make a show of refusing to dance with him would certainly raise undue speculation. Not to mention that Daphne really didn't particularly relish getting drawn into a conversation with the Featheringtons, which was sure to happen if she didn't make immediate haste for the dance floor. And finally, she kind of, sort of, just a little teeny bit actually wanted to dance with the Duke. Of course, the arrogant boor didn't even give her the chance to accept. Before Daphne could manage an "I'd be delighted" or even a mere yes, he had her halfway across the room. The orchestra was still producing those awful noises it makes while the musicians were getting ready to begin, so they were forced to wait a moment before they actually danced. "Thank God you didn't refuse," the Duke said with great feeling. "When would I have had the opportunity?" He grinned at her. Daphne answered that with a scowl. "I wasn't given the opportunity to accept either, if you recall." He raised a brow. "Does that mean I must ask you again?" "No, of course not," Daphne replied, rolling her eyes. "That would be rather childish of me, don't you think? And besides, it would cause a terrible scene, which I don't think either of us desires." He cocked his head and gave her a rather assessing glance, as if he had analyzed her personality in an instant and decided she might just be acceptable. Daphne found the experience somewhat unnerving. Just when the orchestra ceased its discordant warm-up and struck the first notes of a waltz, Simon groaned. "Do young ladies still need permission to waltz?" Daphne found herself smiling at his discomfort. "How long have you been away?" "5 years. Do they?" "Yes." "Do you have it?" He looked almost pained at the prospect of his escape plan falling apart. "Of course." He swept her into his arms and whirled her into the throng of elegantly clad couples. Good. They had made a full circle of the ballroom before Daphne asked, "How much of our meeting did you reveal to my brothers? I saw you with them, you know." Simon only smiled. "What are you grinning about?" she asked suspiciously. "I was merely marveling at your restraint." "I beg your pardon?" He shrugged slightly, his shoulders rising as his head tilted to the right. "I hadn't thought you the most patient of ladies," he said, "and here it took you a full 3.5 minutes before asking me about my conversation with your brothers." Daphne fought a blush. The truth was, the Duke was a most accomplished dancer, and she'd been enjoying the waltz too much even to think of conversation. But since you asked, he said, mercifully sparing her from having to make a comment, all I told them was that I ran into you in the hall and that, given your coloring, I instantly recognized you as a Bridgerton and introduced myself. Do you think they believed you? Yes, he said softly. I rather think they did. Not that we have anything to hide, she added quickly. Of course not. If there is any villain in this piece, it is most certainly Nigel. Of course. She chewed on her lower lip. Do you think he is still out in the hall? I certainly have no intention of finding out. There was an awkward moment of silence, and then Daphne said, It has been some time since you have attended a London ball, has it not? Nigel and I must have been quite a welcome. You were a welcome sight. He was not. She smiled slightly at the compliment. Aside from our little escape, have you been enjoying your evening? Simon's answer was so unequivocally in the negative that he actually snorted a laugh before saying it. Really? Daphne replied, her brows arching with curiosity. Now that's interesting. You find my agony interesting? Remind me never to turn to you should I ever fall ill. Oh, please, she scoffed. It can't have been that bad. Oh, it can. Certainly not as bad as my evening. You did look rather miserable with your mother and Macclesfield, he allowed. How kind of you to point it out, she muttered. But I still think my evening was worse. Daphne laughed, a light musical sound that warmed Simon's bones. What a sad pair we are, she said. Surely we can manage a conversation on a topic other than our respective terrible evenings. Simon said nothing. Daphne said nothing. Well, I can't think of anything, he said. Daphne laughed again, this time with more gaiety, and Simon once again found himself mesmerized by her smile. I give in, she gasped. What has turned your evening into such a dreadful affair? What or whom? Whom? She echoed, tilting her head as she looked at him. This grows even more interesting. I can't think of any number of adjectives to describe all of the whom I have had the pleasure of meeting this evening, but interesting is not one of them. Now, she chided, don't be rude. I did see you chatting with my brothers after all. He nodded gallantly, tightening his hand slightly at her waist as they swung around in a graceful arc. My apologies. The Bridgertons are, of course, excluded from my insults. We are all relieved, I am sure. Simon cracked a smile at her deadpan wit. I live to make Bridgertons happy. Now that is a statement that may come back to haunt you, she chided. But in all seriousness, what has you in such a dither? If your evening has gone that far downhill since our interlude with Nigel, you're in sad straits indeed. How shall I put this, he mused, so that I do not completely offend you? Oh, go right ahead, she said blithely. I promise not to be offended. Simon grinned wickedly. A statement that may come back to haunt you. She blushed slightly. The color was barely noticeable in the shadowy candlelight, but Simon had been watching her closely. She didn't say anything, however, so he added, Very well, if you must know, I have been introduced to every single unmarried lady in the ballroom. A strange snorting sound came from the vicinity of her mouth. Simon had the sneaking suspicion that she was laughing at him. I have also, he continued, been introduced to all of their mothers. She gurgled. She actually gurgled. Bad show, he scolded, laughing at your dance partner. I'm sorry, she said, her lips tight from trying not to smile. No, you're not. All right, she admitted, I'm not, but only because I have had to suffer the same torture for 2 years. It's difficult to summon too much pity for a mere evening's worth. Why don't you just find someone to marry and put yourself out of misery? She shot him a sharp look. Are you asking? Simon felt the blood leave his face. I thought not. She took one look at him and let out an impatient exhale. Oh, for goodness sake. You can start breathing now, Your Grace. I was only teasing. Simon wanted to make some sort of dry, cutting, and utterly ironic comment, but the truth was, she had so startled him that he couldn't utter a word. To answer your question, she continued, her voice a touch more brittle than he was accustomed to hearing from her, a lady must consider her options. There is Nigel, of course, but I think we must agree he is not suitable as a candidate. Simon shook his head. Earlier this year, there was Lord Chalmers. He frowned. Isn't he on the darker side of 60? Yes. And since I would someday like to have children, it seemed some men that age can still serve brats, Simon pointed out. It wasn't a risk I was prepared to take, she returned. Besides, she shuddered slightly, a look of revulsion passing over her features. I didn't particularly care to have children with him. Much to his annoyance, Simon found himself picturing Daphne in bed with the elderly Chalmers. It was a disgusting image, and it left him feeling faintly furious. At whom he didn't know, maybe at himself for even bothering to imagine the damned thing, but before Lord Chalmers, Daphne continued, thankfully interrupting his rather unpleasant thought process. There were 2 brothers, both just as repulsive. Simon looked at her thoughtfully. Do you want to marry? Well, of course. Her face registered her surprise. Doesn't everyone? I don't. She smiled condescendingly. You think you don't. All men think they don't, but you will. No, he said emphatically. I will never marry. She gaped at him. Something in the Duke's tone of voice told her that he truly meant what he said. What about your title? Simon shrugged. What about it? If you don't marry and Sir and Herr, it will expire, or go to some beastly cousin. That caused him to raise an amused brow. And how do you know that my cousins are beastly? All cousins who are next in line for a title are beastly. She cocked her head in a mischievous manner. Or at least, they are according to the men who actually possess the title. And this is information you've gleaned from your extensive knowledge of men? He teased. She shot him a devastatingly superior grin. Of course. Simon was silent for a moment, and then he asked, Is it worth it? She looked bemused by his sudden change of subject. Is what worth it? He let go of her hand just long enough to wave at the crowd. This, this endless parade of parties, your mother nipping at your heels. Daphne let out a surprised chuckle. I doubt she'd appreciate the metaphor. She fell silent for a moment, her eyes taking on a faraway look as she said, "But yes, I suppose it is worth it. It has to be worth it." She snapped back to attention and looked back to his face, her dark eyes meltingly honest. "I want a husband. I want a family. It's not so silly when you think about it. I'm 14. I am fourth of 8 children. All I know are large families. I shouldn't know how to exist outside of one." Simon caught her gaze, his eyes burning hot and intense into hers. A warning bell sounded in his mind. He wanted her. He wanted her so desperately he was straining against his clothing, but he could never, ever so much as touch her, because to do so would be to shatter every last one of her dreams. And rake or not, Simon wasn't certain he could live with himself if he did that. He would never marry, never sir a child, and that was all she wanted out of life. He might enjoy her company. He wasn't certain he could deny himself that, but he had to leave her untouched for another man. "Your Grace," she said quietly. When he blinked, she smiled and said, "You were wool gathering." Wool gathering. He inclined his head graciously, merely pondering your words. "And did they meet with your approval?" "Actually, I can't remember the last time I conversed with someone with such obvious good sense." He added in a slow voice, "It is good to know what you want out of life. Do you know what you want?" Ah, how to answer that? There were some things he knew he could not say, but it was so easy to talk to this girl. Something about her put his mind at ease, even as his body tingled with desire. By all rights, they should not have been having such a frank conversation so soon into an acquaintance, but somehow it just felt natural. Finally, he just said, "I made some decisions when I was younger. I tried to live with I tried to live my life according to those vows." She looked ravenously curious, but good manners prevented her from questioning him further. "My goodness," she said with a slightly forced smile, "we've grown serious." And here I thought all we meant to debate was whose evening was less pleasant. That they were both trapped, Simon realized, trapped by their society's conventions and expectations. And that's when an idea popped into his mind. A strange, wild, and appallingly wonderful idea. It was probably also a dangerous idea, since it would put him in her company for long periods of time, which would certainly leave him in a perpetual state of unfulfilled desire. But Simon valued his self-control above all else, and he was certain he could control his baser urges. "Wouldn't you like a respite?" he asked suddenly. "A respite?" she echoed bemusedly, even as they twirled across the floor. She looked from side to side. "From this?" "Not precisely. This you'll still have to endure. What I envision is more of a respite from your mother." Daphne choked on her surprise. "You're going to remove my mother from the social world? Doesn't that seem a touch extreme?" I'm not talking about removing your mother. Rather, I want to remove you. Daphne tripped over her feet, and then, just as soon as she'd regained her balance, she tripped over his. I beg your pardon? I had hoped to ignore London society altogether, he explained, but I'm finding that may prove to be impossible. Because you've suddenly developed a taste for ratafia and weak lemonade, she quipped. No, he said, ignoring her sarcasm. Because I have discovered that half of my university friends married in my absence, and their wives seem to be obsessed with throwing the perfect party. And you've been invited? He nodded grimly. Daphne leaned in close, as if she were about to tell him a grave secret. Your Duke, she whispered. You can say no. She watched with fascination as his jaw tightened. These men, he said, their husbands, they are my friends. Daphne felt her lips moving into an unbidden grin. And you don't want to hurt their wives' feelings? Simon scowled, clearly uncomfortable with the compliment. Well, I'll be, she said mischievously. You might just be a nice person after all. I'm hardly nice, he scoffed. Perhaps, but you're hardly cruel either. The music drew to a close, and Simon took her arm and guided her to the perimeter of the ballroom. Their dance had deposited them on the opposite side of the room from Daphne's family, so they had time to continue their conversation as they walked slowly back to the Bridgertons. What I was trying to say, he said, before you so skilfully diverted me, was that it appears I must attend a certain number of London events. Hardly a fate worse than death. He ignored her editorial. You, I gather, must attend them as well. She gave him a single regal nod. Perhaps there's a way that I might be spared the attentions of the Featheringtons and the like, and at the same time you might be spared the matchmaking efforts of your mother. She looked at him intently. Go on. We? He leaned forward, his eyes mesmerizing hers. Will form an attachment. Daphne said nothing, absolutely nothing. She just stared at him as if she were trying to decide if he were the rudest man on the face of the earth or simply mad in the head. Not a true attachment, Simon said impatiently. Good heavens, what sort of man do you think I am? Well, I was warned about your reputation, she pointed out, and you yourself tried to terrify me with your rakish ways earlier this evening. I did no such thing. Of course you did. She patted his arm. But I forgive you. I'm sure you couldn't help it. Simon gave her a startled look. I don't believe I have ever been condescending to a woman before. She shrugged. It was probably past time. Do you know, I'd thought that you were unmarried, because your brothers had scared off all your suitors. But now I wonder if you did it all on your own. Much to his surprise, she just laughed. No, she said. I am unmarried because everyone sees me as a friend. No one ever has any romantic interest in me. She grimaced. Except Nigel. Simon pondered her words for a few moments, then realized that his plan could work to her benefit even more than he'd originally imagined. Listen, he said, and listen quickly because we're almost back to your family, and Anthony looks as if he's about to bolt in our direction any minute now. but they both glanced quickly to the right. Anthony was still trapped in conversation with the Featheringtons. He did not look happy. Here's my plan, Simon continued, his voice low and intense. We shall pretend to have developed a tender for each other. I won't have quite so many debutantes thrown in my direction, because it will be perceived that I am no longer available. No, it won't, Daphne replied. They won't believe you're unavailable until you're standing up before the bishop taking your vows. The very thought made his stomach churn. Nonsense, he said. It may take a bit of time, but I'm sure I will eventually be able to convince society that I am not anyone's candidate for marriage. Except mine, Daphne pointed out. Except yours, he agreed. But we will know what isn't true, or that it's not true. Of course, she murmured. Frankly, I do not believe that this will work. But if you're convinced, I am. Well then, what do I gain? For one thing, your mother will stop dragging you from man to man if she thinks you have secured my interest. Rather conceited of you, Daphne mused, but true. Simon ignored her gib. Secondly, he continued, men are always more interested in a woman if they think other women are interested. Meaning? Meaning, quite simply, and pardon my conceit. He shot her a sardonic look to show that he hadn't missed her earlier sarcasm. But if all the world thinks I intend to make you my duchess, all of those men who see you as nothing more than an affable friend will begin to view you in a new light. Her lips pursed, meaning that once you throw me over, I shall have hordes of suitors at my beck and call. Oh, I shall allow you to be the one to cry off, he said gallantly. He noticed she didn't bother to thank him. I still think I'm gaining much more from this arrangement than you, she said. He squeezed her arm slightly. Then you'll do it? Daphne looked at Mrs. Featherington, who looked like a bird of prey, and then at her brother, who looked as if he had swallowed a chicken bone. She'd seen those expressions a dozen of times before, except on the faces of her own mother and some hapless potential suitor. Yes, she said, her voice firm. Yes, I'll do it. What do you suppose is taking them so long? Violet Bridgerton tugged on her eldest son's sleeve, unable to take her eyes off of her daughter, who appeared to have thoroughly captured the attention of the Duke of Hastings. Only 1 week in London, and already the catch of the season. I don't know, Anthony replied, looking gratefully at the backs of the Featheringtons as they moved on to their next victim. But it feels as if it's been hours. Do you think he likes her? Violet asked, excitedly. Do you think our Daphne truly has a chance to be a duchess? Anthony's eyes filled with a mixture of impatience and disbelief. Mother, you told Daphne she wasn't even to be seen with him, and now you're thinking of marriage? I spoke prematurely, Violet said with a blithe wave of her hand. Clearly he's a man of great refinement and taste. And how, may I ask, do you know what I said to Daphne? Daph told me, of course. Anthony lied. Well, I am certain that Portia Featherington won't be forgetting this evening any time soon. Anthony's eyes widened. Are you trying to marry Daphne off so that she might be happy as a wife? And a mother? Or are you just trying to beat Mrs. Featherington to the altar? The former, of course, Violet replied in a huff, and I am offended you would even imply otherwise. Her eyes strayed off of Daphne and the Duke for just long enough to locate Portia Featherington and her daughters. But I certainly shan't mind seeing the look on her face when she realizes that Daphne will make the season's greatest match. Mother, you are hopeless. Certainly not. Shameless, perhaps, but never hopeless. Anthony just shook his head and muttered something under his breath. It is impolite to mumble, Violet said, mostly just to annoy him. Then she spotted Daphne and the Duke. Ah, here they come. Anthony, behave yourself. Daphne, your Grace. She paused as the couple made their way to their side. I trust you enjoyed your dance? Very much, Simon murmured. Your daughter is as grateful. Your daughter is as graceful as she is lovely. Anthony let out a snort. Simon ignored him. I hope we may have the pleasure of dancing together again soon. Violet positively glowed. Oh, I am sure Daphne would adore that. When Daphne didn't answer with all possible haste, she added quite pointedly, Wouldn't you, Daphne? Of course, Daphne said demurely. I'm certain your mother would never be so lax as to allow me a second waltz, Simon said, looking every inch the debonair Duke. But I do hope she will permit us to take a stroll around the ballroom. You just took a stroll around the ballroom, Anthony pointed out. Simon ignored him again. He said to Violet, We shall, of course, remain in your sight at all times. The lavender silk fan in Violet's hand began to flutter rapidly. I should be delighted. I mean, Daphne should be delighted. Shouldn't you, Daphne? Daphne was all innocence. Oh, I should. And I, Anthony snapped, should take a dose of laudanum, for clearly I am fevered. What the devil is going on? Anthony, Violet explained. She turned hastily to Simon. Don't mind him. Oh, I never do, Simon said affably. Daphne, Anthony said pointedly, I should be delighted to act as your chaperone. Really, Anthony? Violet cut in. They hardly need one if they are to remain here in the ballroom. Oh, I insist. You two run along, Daphne said to Daphne and Simon, waving her hand at them. Anthony will be with you just a moment. Anthony tried to follow immediately, but Violet grabbed onto his wrist hard. What the devil do you think you're doing? She hissed. Protecting my sister. From the Duke? He can't be that wicked. Actually, he reminds me of you. Anthony groaned. Then she definitely needs my protection. Violet patted him on the arm. Don't be so overprotective. If he attempts to spirit her out onto the balcony, I promise you may dash out to rescue her. But until that unlikely event occurs, please allow your sister her moment of glory. Anthony glared at Simon's back. Tomorrow I will kill him. Dear me, Violet said, shaking her head. I had no idea you could be so high-strung. One would think, as your mother, I would know these things, especially since you are my firstborn, unless I have known you for the longest of any of my children. But is that Colin? Anthony interrupted, his voice strangled. Violet blinked. then squinted her eyes. Why, yes, it is. Isn't it lovely that he returned earlier? I could hardly believe my eyes when I saw him an hour ago. In fact, I had better go to him, Anthony said quickly. He looks lonely. Goodbye, Mother. Violet watched as Anthony ran off, presumably to escape her chattering lecture. Silly boy, she muttered to herself. None of her children seemed to be on to any of her tricks. Just blather on about nothing in particular, and she could be rid of any of them in a trice. She let out a satisfied sigh and resumed her watch of her daughter, now on the other side of the ballroom, her hand nestled comfortably in the crook of the Duke's elbow. They made a most handsome couple. Yes, Violet thought, her eyes growing misty, her daughter would make an excellent duchess. Then she let her gaze wander briefly over to Anthony, who was now right where she wanted him, out of her hair. She allowed herself a secret smile. Children were so easy to manage. Then her smile turned to a frown as she noticed Daphne walking back toward her on the arm of another man. Violet's eyes immediately scanned the ballroom until she found the Duke. Dash it all, what the devil was he doing dancing with Penelope Featherington? It has been reported to this author that the Duke of Hastings mentioned no fewer than 6 times yester that he has no plans to marry. If his intention was to discourage the ambitious mammas, he made a grave error in judgment. They will simply view his remarks as the greatest of challenges. And, in an interesting side note, his half-dozen anti-matrimony remarks were all uttered before he made the acquaintance of the lovely and sensible Miss Daphne Bridgerton. Lady Whistledown, Society Papers, April 30th, 1813. The following afternoon found Simon standing on the front steps of Daphne's home, one hand rapping the brass knocker on the door, the other wrapped around a large bouquet of fiendishly expensive tulips. It hadn't occurred to him that his little charade might require his attention during the daylight hours, but during their stroll about the ballroom the previous night, Daphne had sagely pointed out that if he did not call upon her the next day, no one, least of all her mother, would truly believe he was interested. Simon accepted her words as truth, allowing that Daphne almost certainly had more knowledge in this area of etiquette than he did. He'd dutifully found some flowers and trudged across Grosvenor Square to Bridgerton House. He'd never courted a respectable woman before, so the ritual was foreign to him. The door was opened almost immediately by the Bridgertons' butler. Simon gave him his card. The butler, a tall, thin man with a hawkish nose, looked at it for barely a quarter-second before nodding and murmuring, "Right this way, Your Grace." Clearly, Simon thought wryly, he had been expected. What was unexpected, however, was the sight that awaited him when he was shown into the Bridgertons' drawing-room. Daphne, a vision in ice-blue silk, perched on the edge of Lady Bridgerton's green damask sofa, her face decorated with another one of those wide smiles. It would have been a lovely sight had she not been surrounded by at least a half-dozen men, one of whom had actually descended to one knee, gales of poetry spewing from his mouth. Judging from the florid nature of the prose, Simon fully expected a rosebush to sprout from the nitwit's mouth at any moment. The entire scene, Simon decided, was most disagreeable. He fixed his gaze on Daphne, who was directing her magnificent smile at the buffoon reciting poetry, and waited for her to acknowledge him. She didn't. Simon looked down at his free hand and noticed that it was curled into a tight fist. He scanned the room slowly, trying to decide on which man's face to use it. Daphne smiled again and again, not at him. The idiot poet. Definitely the idiot poet. Simon tilted his head slightly to the side as he analyzed the young swain's face. Would his fist fit best in the right eye socket or the left? Or maybe that was too violent. Maybe a light clip to the chin would be more appropriate. At the very least, it might actually shut the man up. This one, the poet announced grandly, I wrote in your honor last night. Simon groaned. The last poem he had recognized as a rather grandiose rendition of a Shakespearean sonnet, but an original work was more than he could bear. Your Grace! Simon looked up to realize that Daphne had finally noticed that he had entered the room. He nodded regally, his cool look very much at odds with the puppy-dog faces of her other suitors. Miss Bridgerton. How lovely to see you, she said, a delighted smile crossing her face. Ah, that was more like it. Simon straightened the flowers and started to walk toward her, only to realize that there were 3 young suitors in his path, and none appeared inclined to move. Simon pierced the first one with his haughtiest stare, which caused the boy, really, he looked all of 20, hardly old enough to be called a man, to cough in a most unattractive manner and scurry off to an unoccupied window seat. Simon moved forward, ready to repeat the procedure with the next annoying young man, when the Viscountess suddenly stepped into his path, wearing a dark blue frock and a smile that might possibly rival Daphne's in its brightness. Your Grace, she said excitedly, what a pleasure to see you. You honor us with your presence. I could hardly imagine myself anywhere else, Simon murmured as he took her gloved hand and kissed it. Your daughter is an exceptional young lady. The Viscountess sighed contentedly. And such lovely, lovely flowers, she said, once she was finished with her little revel of maternal pride. Are they from Holland? They must have been terribly dear. Mother, Daphne said sharply. She extricated her hand from the grasp of a particularly energetic suitor and made her way over. What can the Duke possibly say to that? I could tell her how much I paid for them, he said with a devilish half-smile. You wouldn't. He leaned forward, lowering his voice so that only Daphne could hear. Didn't you remind me last night that I'm a duke? He murmured. I thought you told me I could do anything I wanted. Yes, but not that, Daphne said with a dismissive wave of her hand. You would never be so crass. Of course the Duke would not be crass, her mother exclaimed, clearly horrified that Daphne would even mention the word in his presence. What are you talking about? Why wouldn't he be crass? The flowers, Simon said. The cost. Daphne thinks I shouldn't tell you. Tell me later, the Viscountess whispered out of the side of her mouth, when she's not listening. Then she moved back over to the green damask sofa where Daphne had been sitting with her suitors. and cleared it out in under 3 seconds. Simon had to admire the military precision with which she managed the maneuver. There now, the Viscountess said. Isn't that convenient? Daphne, why don't you and the Duke sit right there? You mean where Lord Railmount and Mr. Crane were sitting just moments ago? Daphne asked innocently. Precisely, her mother replied, with what Simon considered to be an admirable lack of obvious sarcasm. Besides, Mr. Crane said that he has to meet his mother at Gunter's at 3. Daphne glanced at the clock. It's only 2, Mother. The traffic, Violet said with a sniff, is nothing short of dreadful these days. Far too many horses on the road. It ill becomes a man, Simon said, getting into the spirit of the conversation, to keep his mother waiting. Well said, Your Grace, Violet beamed. You can be sure that I have expressed that very same sentiment to my own children. And in case you're not sure, Daphne said with a smile, I'd be happy to vouch for her. Violet merely smiled. If anyone should know, it would be you. Daphne, now, if you will excuse me, I have business to attend to. Oh, Mr. Crane, Mr. Crane! Your mother would never forgive me if I did not shoo you out in time. She bustled off, taking the hapless Mr. Crane by the arm and leading him toward the door, barely giving him time to say farewell. Daphne turned to Simon with an amused expression. I can't quite decide if she is being terribly polite or exquisitely rude. Exquisitely polite, perhaps? Simon said mildly. She shook her head. Oh, definitely not that. The alternative, of course, is terribly rude. Daphne grinned and watched as her mother looped her arm through Lord Railmount's, pointed him toward Daphne so that he could not nod his goodbye, and led him from the room. And then, as if by magic, the remaining Boo murmured their hasty farewells and followed suit. Remarkably efficient, isn't she? Daphne murmured. Your mother? She's a marvel. She'll be back, of course. Pity. And here I thought I had you well and truly in my clutches. Daphne laughed. I don't know how anyone considered you a rake. Your sense of humor is far too superb. And here we rakes thought we were so wickedly droll. A rake's humor, Daphne stated, is essentially cruel. Her comment surprised him. He stared at her intently, searching her brown eyes, and yet not really knowing what it was he was looking for. There was a narrow ring of green just outside her pupils, the color as deep and rich as moss. He'd never seen her in the daylight before, he realized. Your Grace? Daphne's quiet voice snapped him out of his daze. Simon blinked. I beg your pardon? You looked 1,000 miles away, she said, her brow wrinkling. I've been 1,000 miles away. He fought the urge to return his gaze to her eyes. This is entirely different. Daphne let out a little laugh, the sound positively musical. You have, haven't you? And here I've never even been past Lancashire. What a provincial I must be. He brushed aside her remark. You must forgive my wool gathering. We were discussing my lack of humor, I believe. We are not, and you well know it. Her hands found their way to her hips. I specifically told you that you were in possession of a sense of humor far superior to that of the average rake. One of his brows lifted in a rather superior manner. And you wouldn't classify your brother as rakes? They only think they are rakes, she corrected. There is a considerable difference. Simon snorted. If Anthony isn't a rake, I pity the woman who meets the man who is. There's more to being a rake than seducing legions of women, Daphne said blithely. If a man can't do more than poke his tongue into a woman's mouth and kiss. Simon felt his throat close up, but somehow he managed to sputter. You should not be speaking of such things, she shrugged. You shouldn't even know about them, he grunted. 4 brothers, she said by way of an explanation. Well, 3, I guess. Gregory is too young to count. Someone ought to tell them to hold their tongues around you. She shrugged again, this time with only one shoulder. Half the time they don't even notice I am there. Simon couldn't imagine that. But we seem to have veered away from the original subject, she said. All I meant to say is that a rake's humor has its basis in cruelty. He needs a victim, or he cannot imagine ever laughing at himself. You, Your Grace, are rather clever with the self-deprecating remark. I just don't know whether to thank you or throttle you. Throttle me? Good heavens, why? She laughed again, a rich, throaty sound that Simon felt deep in his gut. He exhaled slowly, the long whoosh of air just barely steadying his pulse. If she continued laughing, he wasn't going to be able to answer to the consequences. But she just kept looking at him, her wide mouth curved into one of those smiles that looked as if it were perpetually on the verge of laughter. I am going to throttle you, he growled, on general principle. And what principle is that? The general principle of man, he blustered. Her brows lifted dubiously. As opposed to the general principle of woman? Simon looked around. Where's your brother? You're far too cheeky. Surely someone needs to take you in hand. Oh, I'm sure you'll be seeing more of Anthony. In fact, I'm surprised he hasn't made an appearance yet. He was quite irate last night. I was forced to listen to a full hour's lecture on your many faults and sins. The sins are almost certainly exaggerated. And the faults? Probably true, Simon admitted sheepishly. That remark earned him another smile from Daphne. Well, true or not, she said, he thinks you're up to something. I am up to something. Her head tilted sarcastically as her eyes rolled upward. He thinks you're up to something nefarious. I'd like to be up to something nefarious, he muttered. What was that? Nothing. She frowned. I think we should tell Anthony about our plan. And what could possibly be the benefit to that? Daphne remembered the full-hour grilling she'd endured the previous night and just said, Oh, I think I'll let you figure that out for yourself. Simon merely raised his brows. My dear Daphne, her lips parted slightly in surprise. Surely you're not going to force me to call you Miss Bridgerton? He sighed dramatically. After all that we've been through. We've been through nothing, you ridiculous man. But I suppose you may call me Daphne nonetheless. Excellent. He nodded in a condescending manner. You may call me Your Grace. She swatted him. Very well, he replied, his lips twitching at the corners. Simon, if you must. Oh, I must, Daphne said, rolling her eyes. Clearly I must. He leaned toward her, something odd and slightly hot sparkling in the depths of his pale eyes. Must you? He murmured. I should be very excited to hear it. Daphne had the sudden sense that he was talking about something far more intimate than the mere mention of his given name. A strange, tingling sort of heat shot down her arms, and without thinking, she jumped back a step. Those flowers are quite lovely, she blurted out. He regarded them lazily, rotating the bouquet with his wrist. Yes, they aren't they? I adore them. They're not for you. Daphne choked on air. Simon grinned. They're for your mother. Her mouth slowly opened in surprise, a short little gasp of air passing through her lips before she said, Oh, you clever, clever man. She will positively melt at your feet. But this will come back to haunt you, you know. He gave her an arch look. Oh, really? Really? She will be more determined than ever to drag you to the altar. You shall be just as beleaguered at parties as if we hadn't concocted this scheme. Nonsense, he scoffed. Before I would have to endure the attentions of dozens of ambitious mammas, now I must deal with only one. Her tenacity might surprise you, Daphne muttered. Then she twisted her head to look out the partially open door. She must truly like you, she added. She's left us alone far longer than is proper. Simon pondered that and leaned forward to whisper. Could she be listening at the door? Daphne shook her head. No, we would have heard her shoes clicking down the hall. Something about that statement made him smile, and Daphne found herself smiling right along with him. I really should thank you, though, she said, before she returns. Oh, why is that? Your plan is a brilliant success, at least for me. Did you notice how many suitors came to call this morning? He crossed his arms, the tulips dangling upside down. I noticed. It's brilliant, really. I've never had so many callers in a single afternoon before. Mother was beside herself with pride. Even Humboldt, he's our butler, was beginning, and I've never seen him so much as smile before. Oops, look, you're dripping. She leaned down and righted the flowers, her forearm grazing the front of his coat. She immediately jumped back, startled by both the heat and power of him. Goodness, if she could sense all that through his shirt and coat, what must he be like? Daphne colored red, deep, dark red. I should give my entire fortune for those thoughts, Simon said, his brows rising in question. Thankfully, Violet chose that moment to sail into the room. I'm terribly sorry for abandoning you for so long, she said, but Mr. Crane's horse threw a shoe, so naturally I had to accompany him to the stables and find a groom to repair the damage. In all their years together, which, Daphne thought, acerbically, naturally constituted her entire life, Daphne had never known her mother to step foot in the stables. You are truly an exceptional hostess, Simon said, holding out the flowers. Here, these are for you. For me? Violet's mouth fell open in surprise, and a strange little breathy sound escaped her lips. Are you certain? Because I... She looked over at Daphne, and then at Simon, and then finally back at her daughter. Are you certain? Absolutely. Violet blinked rapidly, and Daphne noticed that they were actually tears in her mother's eyes. No one ever gave her flowers, she realized. At least not since her father had died 10 years earlier. Violet was such a mother. Daphne had forgotten that she was a woman as well. I don't know what to say, Violet sniffled. Try thank you, Daphne whispered in her ear, her grin lending warmth to her voice. Oh, Daph, you are the worst. Violet swatted her in the arm, looking more like a young woman than Daphne had ever seen. But thank you, Your Grace. These are beautiful blooms, but more importantly, it was a most thoughtful gesture. I shall treasure this moment always. Simon looked as if he were about to say something, but in the end he just smiled and inclined his head. Daphne looked at her mother, saw the unmistakable joy in her cornflower blue eyes, and realized with a touch of shame that none of her own children had ever acted in such a thoughtful manner as this man standing beside her. The Duke of Hastings, Daphne decided then and there that she'd be a fool if she didn't fall in love with him. Of course, it would be nice if he returned the sentiment. Mother, Daphne said, would you like me to fetch you a vase? What? Violet was still too busy sniffing blissfully at her flowers to pay attention to her daughter's words. Oh yes, of course. Ask Humboldt for the cut crystal from my grandmother. Daphne flashed a grateful smile at Simon and headed for the door, but before she could take more than 2 steps, the large and forbidding form of her eldest brother materialized in the doorway. Daphne, Anthony growled, just the person I needed to see.